It is my pleasure to welcome to the truth now Liz Peek. She is a Fox Business regular contributor. She's on with Mornings with Maria. She's all over Fox News and also is an author. She's written articles for the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. And I am quick to add that she is my friend. Liz, welcome back to the truth. It's so nice to have you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
We're also joined by Robert Corn-Revere. He is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Davis Wright Tremaine, LLP, specializing in freedom of expression and communications law. I guess I should say he was a partner there. He is now the general counsel or chief counsel for FIRE. They're a public interest 501c3 that works to defend your and my free speech. Robert, welcome.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
So, Liz, I watched President Trump signing executive orders the other day, and he signed an executive order saying that men could not compete in women's sports. And while he was doing it, he just sort of shook his head and said, I can't even believe we're talking about this stuff. And that's the way I feel about free speech. Why are we even talking about this? My entire life, the rule has been that you can say whatever you want to whomever you want, wherever you want, as long as you do not use language that could put other people in danger, like saying fire in a crowded theater. How have we lost our way?
Well, I think that's a really good question. As someone on the right side of the political aisle, I would point out that during Joe Biden's administration, we had the government actually actively suppressing dissenting points of view about, for example, how to treat COVID. That was probably the first instance, a really glaring instance of where the government was leaning on social media companies to deplatform doctors, even eminent doctors, who didn't agree with the advice that was coming down from the NIH and the CDC in our country about where COVID came from and how to treat it, what kinds of medicines you might explore, et cetera. And when you consider that this was a brand new virus that was killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, and it had, and you would have thought that the scientific community would have welcomed experimentation, exploration, all kinds of ideas about what to do. And in fact, in the aftermath, it turns out a lot of those doctors were right, that medicines like ivermectin actually had a use in helping people get over COVID. So that was maybe, I think, for a lot of people, the first instance where we all looked at the government and said, oh my gosh, they really are leaning on people. And of course, we didn't know that until Elon Musk bought Twitter and exposed the Twitter files, which really brought home just how egregious the government's behavior had been. Fast forward, you had Joe Biden during his term as presidency didn't try to put in place, he actually did put in place a government agency that was meant to cut down on disinformation. And even though that caused such a ruckus because it was so clearly an Orwellian statement about the government's intent of ferreting out, again, opinions that they didn't approve of, and it was shut down almost immediately. Nonetheless, I think all of us kind of came to be on guard when Hillary Clinton and Al Gore and various other people would talk about disinformation being a real problem, and that this was something we had to fight against. Okay, there's a lot of, indeed, bad ideas on Twitter and on Facebook and Instagram. In fact, there is misinformation. But the real question, John, now and always, is who is making that determination? And so I would just tell you, I went to a luncheon for Jonathan Turley, the law professor from George Washington University, and Jonathan has written a book about free speech. And he said that there were six, and I've checked this out, it's true, six major academic books out on freedom of speech. His is the only one that defends it. The other five find legal reason why we should abandon freedom of speech in our Constitution or as a right to be expected by Americans, which I think is chilling. Anyway, I'll stop there.
No,
but I can go on and on.
that is a perfect setup, and it's a good lead-in for my paradigm. And if you consider, I was thinking about this when we were sitting in the luncheon the other day with the CEO of FIRE, and Robert, I want you to tell us about FIRE, what it stands for, and what you all do. But as I was sitting there listening, the thought occurred to me that if oxygen is essential for life, and I almost thought, like, is there anybody in this room who doesn't like oxygen? And you want to be free. It seems to me that freedom of speech is the oxygen for our freedom. And without free speech, there is no oxygen, there is no freedom. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, John. And that is the very principle that FIRE is based on. FIRE stands for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We've been doing this for 25 years, although I left private practice and joined FIRE full-time just a little over a year and a half ago. But I've been litigating First Amendment cases for 40 years. I have basically devoted my professional life to defending this, and not just the law of free expression. What we try and stand for here is a much broader concept, and that is a culture of free expression. The law and the constitutional guarantees embodied in the First Amendment are really just the legal floor for what free speech should be permitted. But the culture of free expression is something that individuals carry with them, and that's to welcome the interchange of ideas you disagree with. You should welcome those to sharpen your own thinking. And that's true not just for the way we live our lives, but also the way in which our government operates. I think Liz was asking all of the right questions, although let me just take this opportunity, since she mentioned Jonathan Turley and his book, and that it was the only one out there defending free speech. I'll use this as a chance to plug my own book, The Mind of the Censor and the Eye of the Beholder, the First Amendment and the Censor's Dilemma. It is another example of where we try and go through the history of free speech and talk about various ways in which government has suppressed it. And I agree with the points that Liz was making earlier, too, about how administrations have been trying to lean on private actors and try and get them to suppress speech, and in particular social media companies. But I would go further and say that this isn't just something from one side of the aisle or the other. FIRE is an expressly nonpartisan organization, and we filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court in opposition to the Biden administration's effort to regulate social media. But at the same time, various states were trying to regulate social media companies as well. Florida and Texas passed laws to regulate how social media companies moderate their platforms because it didn't like the choices they were making. And in my way of thinking, the First Amendment bars either of those activities, either the jawboning by the federal government or the direct regulation by state governments.
Well, the thing that surprises me is that you said that you've devoted a lifetime to this and spanning several decades. Has free speech always been on the chopping block? Have we always had to fight for it?
Oh, we've always had to fight for it. And what a lot of people don't realize is that it is really a fairly modern concept, even though it goes back to the founding of our nation and the adoption of the First Amendment. One of the first things that the founding fathers did when John Adams was president was pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government or the president and bring them into disrepute and make false reports. And that was allowed to lapse under its own terms. And when Thomas Jefferson became president, they pardoned everyone who had been convicted under it and remitted all the fines. And he said that this was as palpably unconstitutional as if we had been ordered to fall down and worship a golden image. And so that was really the beginning of how we understood the First Amendment. And then in the 20th century, courts began to develop First Amendment jurisprudence. But as you point out, John, we've always had to fight for it because politicians of all stripes try and restrict speech they find inconvenient.
Liz, the other thing that perplexes me, that in order for someone to limit another person's free speech, doesn't it necessarily run the risk of then backfiring and erode that censors free speech at a later time? I mean, it just seems to become one big vicious circle that if you're going to limit my speech, I'm going to look for an opportunity to cut you off. So how does that play out?
Well, I think that's exactly right. That is the risk. I think it's, and yes, it is totally a bipartisan, good for FIRE for being a nonpartisan organization. And there are certainly, basically infringements that have come from the right as well as the left. I certainly think that's true. I do think that right now we're having an interesting conversation because of what J.D. Vance did in Europe.
Yeah.
He called out Europe for abandoning free speech among other democratic norms and other democratic values. And what was interesting to me, to get back to your question sort of circuitously, was the shock that the Europeans registered that someone might have noticed that they've been passing laws all over the place that basically inhibit free speech. In other words, in Switzerland now, if you insult somebody online, you post a derogatory remark online, you can go to jail. And in fact, someone did go to jail last year for posting online that someone was a fat lesbian. Yeah. And someone said on Twitter, was it true? I don't know if it was true or not true, but if that was the standard here in the U.S., my gosh, our jails would be overflowing because people insult each other all the time. So it isn't just Switzerland, it's also Germany, where if you, going back to the sedition law, if you insult a public official or criticize a public official, you can be fined for it. In Scotland, they have a new hate speech law. All these come under the heading of hate speech, and there are protected groups. But the problem is the number of groups has proliferated, so it's almost anybody now cannot be insulted or maligned or whatever. And you might say, well, gosh, I don't like to see that stuff on Twitter or Instagram. Of course, I don't think any one of us likes the fact that there is hate speech out there. There are people calling each other names and so forth. But again, it gets back to the issue, and to your point, John, who's making the rules? Who's deciding which groups are protected and what constitutes an insult and what kind of fine should be levied, et cetera? Because the minute you put yourself in that position, yes, you're going to be facing exactly the same kinds of penalties, retribution, et cetera, the next time there's a new group in charge. So better to adopt what FIRE has done and just say, we don't like any kind of abridgment other than putting people in harm's way, of course, in freedom of speech. And we are going to defend everyone's rights across the board, because that's how it should be.
Well, I think the policy in this country has for a long time been that words are to be devalued in terms of the severity of any consequences that come from it. I mean, just as a kid on the playground, the mantra was sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And that seemed to be, I mean, as simple as it is, kind of the policy that governed this country for so long. And somewhere along the line, we developed this hypersensitive attitude towards speech, and particularly a loss to me is the loss of humor. It used to be that Don Rickles would go on Johnny Carson, and by the end of the appearance, he would have insulted everybody in the audience. The benefit was that everybody was in the aisles laughing hysterically. So to me, I don't know any comedian today that is able to get away with not being PG other than perhaps Dave Chappelle. And what a loss for everybody who enjoys humor.
I would agree with you. And some of the favorite old-time television shows like Frasier, if you watch Frasier reruns at this point, you're going to be shocked at the kinds of things that they actually had on air, none of which would be allowed now. And it is a shame because it was witty, it was clever. And, you know, Bob can really talk, I think, very ably, I'm sure. Greg Lukianoff, the head of FIRE, has written a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, talking about in colleges how we have come to the point where kids, to your point earlier, John, think that words can hurt them. Sticks and stones is an old-fashioned expression because now you get trigger warnings if something might raise your heart rate. This is not a joke. I mean, these kids take very seriously both silence is violence. The idea that, for example, after the murder of George Floyd, you weren't allowed to be neutral. You couldn't bow out of the conversation about race and violence and so forth. But also, they think that if you raise a contentious issue, that you might damage them in some way. Well, boy, talk about preparing a generation for failure and preparing a country soon to be run by that generation for serious problems. Because if I, for and an example that Greg uses, I think, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, is, well, I will use an example from a law that was passed about colleges in California, where if you taught something as contentious or controversial as the teachings of Martin Luther King and wanted to engage your classroom in a conversation about that, that was considered very damaging to your students. Why? Not because he talked about race in such a kind of open-minded way, but because just that open-mindedness today is considered harmful and hurtful to Black people or whatever. I mean, honestly, it's gone so far, it really can kind of make your head spin, but it's something that has got to be reversed, and I don't know how it's going to be reversed.
Well, I did have the privilege of interviewing Secretary Wilbur Ross on this program a couple of months ago when he released his new book, Risk and Return in Business and in Life. And he said on the show that we have raised a generation of men in particular who are hypersensitive. And, you say anything the least bit critical to them, they just melt into a pile of rubble. Bob, what do we do? Liz said, what do we do to turn this around?
Well, yeah, and I really appreciated the points that Liz made about fire and about Greg's book. And he had not just the first book, The Coddling of the American Mind, but then his follow-up book, The Canceling of the American Mind, which made many of the same points. And it really goes back to why fire was created in the first place in 1999. It was a reaction to the growing trend on college campuses of speech codes and trigger warnings, and what came later as trigger warnings. But they came around in the late 1980s, 89, early 90s, and it was a growing trend on college campuses, and FIRE was created. And at the time, we were called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And for the first 23 years of our existence, that is what our bailiwick was. We focused on speech in higher education, and it led to all the things that Liz was talking about, where you create this hypersensitivity, this idea that words are violence and that words have to be policed. And for many years, it was really confined to the campus setting. But we've seen this kind of consciousness, this kind of argument about restricting speech to be growing in society in general. And certainly, as J.D. Vance pointed out in his recent speech in Munich, certainly has affected laws in Europe. And so FIRE, as our mission was to deal with this on college campuses, as we saw this becoming more endemic in society in general, expanded our mission to cover not just free speech in higher education, but to free speech in society in general, in all of its manifestations as well. And so we are a much more broadly based organization now. So it was very welcome to hear the message that Vice President Vance delivered in Munich, saying that European countries had lost their way in the way they police regulation of speech. We've tried to prevent that from being embedded in American law as well, and we do it in various ways. And part of what we try and do is to say that we should not be fighting the culture wars through our institutions. It's not government's role to decide, to put its thumb on the scale and to decide which political argument is right and which political argument is wrong. That is what the First Amendment leaves to the people to decide.
I'm sure that both of you have taken personality tests that companies typically give when you apply for a job. And I've taken those tests a number of times in different contexts. And every single test, I score the highest on collaboration. Now, I happen to think that collaboration is a wonderful thing. Even when two people are in violent disagreement, you can still get to a middle ground. Maybe it's neutral corners. Maybe it is actually, we find that we have more to agree to than disagree. But how in the heck are we ever going to do that if we can't talk?
It's a good question. And again, unfortunately, there is, as there has been less appreciation over time for freedom of speech, there's also less appreciation for debate. I keep thinking, when this country right now, there are two groups of people. There are the group of people who, like me, watch Fox News and other right-leaning organizations. And then there are the groups that watch MSNBC and various left-leaning groups. And boy, they have a very different view of nearly everything. And occasionally that comes home really starkly when you're talking to somebody who is politically not aligned with yourself. And by the way, I live in New York, so that's a daily occurrence. You'll say something. I remember we were at a dinner party, and it was a mixed dinner party, that is Democrats and Republicans. We weren't talking politics, but someone raised Kamala Harris's word salads. This is like 2 years ago. And half the people at the table were completely befuddled. They had no idea what we were talking about. Now, it was impossible in that era to be a Republican and not know that Kamala Harris had this tendency to sort of issue 100-word gobbledygooks, which nobody could make heads or tails of. But the other side had never heard about it because it was never covered by the New York Times or MSNBC or whatever. I mean, I think that's a really bad thing, that there is not a single news organization. I prefer to think that I choose to think that Fox News, Brett Baier at 6 o'clock and so forth, really does bring in a lot of Democrats to speak, and they actually do have a pretty open forum. I'm sure Democrats might disagree with that, but it's really a shame that there is so much partisan news, information, et cetera, because the country is really not particularly drawn together by that, and not eager to debate because they see things only one way.
Well, on this show every Saturday at 12, from 12 to 2 on the John Fredericks Radio Network and on Getter, Rumble, X, and YouTube. We're also on the CDM Press Network on 13 digital platforms, and they seek the truth. We actually solicit people from the left to come on. I can't find any takers, and that's a real disappointing thing to me. So I've invented this character that I imitate, a Larry liberal who comes on the truth every now and then, and Larry and I will debate topics. And to my surprise, one day somebody came up and asked me, John, who is that crackpot Larry liberal?
Very funny.
Oh, well, so it illustrates the point that I was going to try and get to. And I'm not trying to be partisan, but I just can't help make the observation that I love to engage in political discourse. I mean, not because I'm trying to get my way or drive a point home, but I'm genuinely intellectually curious. I'm curious why other people don't seem to see that Kamala Harris speaks in word salads. I think it's a diversion so she doesn't have to tell you what she really thinks. But that's my own bias coming through, but I think I'm probably onto something.
Well, I think you are onto something. And, it also reminds me, I got my start as a reporter, and I'm glad that I'm not doing that today. If I were a reporter today, I wouldn't want to have to cover any politician and try and make sense of what they're saying, because to me, it's all a question of evasion and political posturing. I have to agree that the real problem here is the polarization. And John, I couldn't agree with you more that people need to be intellectually curious and to seek out ideas that are not their own, people that disagree with them, to push them to sharpen their opinions. That's what we mean when we talk about a culture of free expression. I find people from both the left and the right guilty of gravitating to their own corners and not engaging with people from the other side.
Bob,
Totally.
tell us a little bit about FIRE exactly in terms of your methodologies. What do you do to try and foster free speech and help us protect our First Amendment?
Well, thank you for that question. And we try and do it in various ways. Our mission is not just to litigate First Amendment cases, and we certainly do that. We have a full litigation department where we take cases and defend people whose rights are being violated. But we also try and educate people about what free speech means, what the law of free speech is, but also about the broader question of the culture of free speech. We also are still, in spite of our expanded mission, we're still actively engaged in promoting free speech on college campuses and monitoring what's going on in that arena, but also in the world in general. We have a communications department that tries to stay engaged and to bring to light First Amendment violations when we see them, and also just to spread the word about both the law of free speech and the broader culture of free expression.
But you are unbiased and nonpartisan, and you've proven that, to me at least, in the case of Donald Trump versus Ann Selzer, where she issued a poll in Iowa just before the election saying that Kamala Harris would win by 3. I think Trump won by 6. So that was a 9-point deviation. Why are you defending Ann Selzer? Or are you issuing a friend of the court brief, or are you actually a party to that case?
No, we are defending Ann Selzer. She is our client, and we're doing it because there's no such thing as a claim for fake news under the First Amendment. I mentioned earlier the Sedition Act, in which early in our history, the federal government tried to pass a law against false news. Well, that tradition is carried with us, and it has been strengthened through the 20th century and now into the 21st century. And what we see here now are the use of lawsuits to try and erode that tradition. When Harry Truman was predicted to have lost the election against Thomas Dewey, the Chicago Tribune blared a front-page headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." Truman's response to that was to, at a whistle stop, hold up the newspaper with a big smile and say, "That ain't the way I heard it." Today, what we have, when you have a poll that got it wrong, is to have the president-elect and now the president filing a lawsuit saying that that is, quote, fake news. And that is completely inconsistent with our protections for free speech and our constitutional traditions. And to me, it doesn't matter which party, which direction it comes from. It is simply inconsistent with our tradition of free speech and free press.
So I'm going to ask you about some other cases. I want to ask you about Ann Selzer. The question I would want to ask you, but I'm not going to, because as an advocate, I don't think you can answer it, but maybe Liz can. What if it were proven that Ann Selzer was acting intentionally, knowingly, that the poll was wrong, it was flawed, or that it was constructed in a way to get a certain result because it was really her intent to influence the outcome of the election? Should there be any repercussions for that kind of devilment? And before you answer that one, let me give you a few more. And Bob, I'll let you weigh on these. Let's go to Liz first. But what about when the mainstream media has reported that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and I think we're about to learn that he didn't even pull the trigger? What about when the mainstream media says Donald Trump asserts election fraud without evidence, and they've maintained that for 4 years in the 2020 election, in spite of the fact that there is overwhelming evidence? I can speak to you about Georgia. I've worked on an election case there for 2.5 years. I've seen the evidence. I've cross-examined the forensic accountants. I've watched the videos of the ladies in the State Farm Tabulating Center taking the same stack of 100 ballots, feeding them through the tabulator multiple times, and 3,200 duplicate ballots on the Secretary of State's own website. And then I had the pleasure of having dinner with Rudy Giuliani last night. What they have done to that man for expressing his free speech and being an advocate for his client is the most despicable act I've ever seen in my lifetime. You're talking about America's mayor who led us through 9/11 and could look the mob in the eye in New York and cleaned up Times Square. And now they have stripped him of his bar license, his reputation, and many of his assets. Is there no remedy for that kind of misbehavior by a media gone mad?
Well, I think Bob can answer this legally, but it does seem to me that Trump has had some victories facing down, if you will, or confronting news organizations that have purposefully misrepresented things. And maybe that's, maybe he's been able to be victorious and win settlements on those because they know that with him being president, they kind of have to get along with him. Or maybe he does actually have legal standing. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. Going back to the Ann Seltzer thing, and I do think it's an interesting case. I know the fire people think it's slam dunk. Trump didn't win by 6 points in Iowa. I think it was 13 or 16. It was overwhelming.
I'm sure you're right.
And so it's almost, and I know Greg Lukianoff has said, look, Ann came out and apologized. I'm not surprised she did because it was egregiously wrong, and she had a reputation as really a very careful and good pollster. But also the fact that it came out right before the election, it sent a message. It sent a message that, gosh, Kamala Harris is doing much better than people think. If she could win Iowa, she could win the country. And that kind of thing can impact turnout and behavior. So I don't see it quite as black and white as fire does. But Bob, what about these other instances where the media clearly is, I mean, it seems to me every day they try to misrepresent things that Trump has done, although he certainly opens the door to some of it.
Well, I'll give you another current day example. I just read in the New York Times this week that Donald Trump asserts that Doge has found massive fraud, abuse, and waste.
But they have without
evidence.
Right? Yeah,
it's the same refrain.
Yeah. I think about 10 of us opinion writers have written about that because it was such a completely ridiculous headline.
Yeah.
Anyway, Bob, what's your view?
And that is the remedy in a free society.
Yeah.
Writers correct what they see as misinformation. As John, you asked earlier in this session, how can you hand government the power to be the arbiter of the truth? That's something we don't do in a free society. And there's also, in addition to the idea of the government being the arbiter of truth, making these accusations through lawfare and trying to use civil actions to try and impose a penalty on someone who's saying something that you don't like. Liz, you mentioned the other settlements by large media companies, and it's something that we're watching closely as well. And the reason is because you now have a new administration with tremendous support and political power, being able to use the levers of government to leverage settlements that I don't think they would get if they had to play these things out in the legal proceedings. But if they can put the screws to large companies that stand to lose a lot more if they don't settle these cases, then you see this happening. But I can tell you that's not going to happen in the case against Ann Seltzer. There will not be a settlement because legally there is no case.
Well, maybe we just resolve that part of the price for free speech is that you have to put up with people who are going to distort, lie, or misrepresent.
Well, and that's why we're engaged in this dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's to the marketplace of ideas to let people decide.
And I am on a website that is for a hobby that I enjoy. And there is a section on this website that is called the hot section where you can go and debate topics of the day. And it does get hot. But people have said, well, I think we should limit this. It's bad for the community. It's not consistent with why we're here. And I've said, look, just leave it there. If you don't want to go there, don't go into the hot section. But if you go there and you make a fool out of yourself or say something dumb, the rest of the people will condemn you and that'll be your punishment. I think that might be the standard.
And that's kind of what social media is all about, right? I mean, if you if you go online on Twitter or Instagram or something and post something that is completely false, and boy, it does happen, and people find out almost immediately and come raining down on you with verbal brickbats. Not everyone has to do it. Not everyone wants to do it. It's pretty effective. And my guess is you don't do it again.
It's a fascinating conversation. I hope that it's one that we can continue. Bob Corn-Revere, I keep calling you the general counsel, but you are actually
Chief counsel.
Chief counsel. And I may need you to represent me. My wife and I are building a new home in West Palm Beach, and she continually tries to limit my right to free speech. And I need some help.
Help you there, pal.
And lizpeek, contributor on Fox Business and Fox News, and a wonderful author and opinion leader. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on The Truth today.
Thank you so much for having us.